Well, hey there, you awesome bipeds, quadrupeds, and even the occasional dinosaurs. It is I, Little Wolf, and welcome to my den. Go ahead and come on in, but please wipe your paws before entering, and go ahead and take a seat by the fire. The cauldron is bubbling, so you can have your choice of tea, coffee, or hot chocolate. And let's go ahead and try something a little bit different that we haven't done before. I have read some stories on here, short stories, Christmas stories, scary stories, things like that, but I haven't read an actual book yet on here. And I think one of the best ones for me to start off with is going to be Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate D. Camello. And I read this one to my daughter a lot when she was little, and we've watched the movie, good lord, numerous amount of times, or at least I have, anyways. I love just about anything to do with dogs. 101 Dalmatians, Benji, Lassie, Because of Winn-Dixie. Oh man, Paw Patrol, even though that's a little kid's cartoon, but it's still dogs. Scooby, Snoopy, all of that. Oh, I just love dogs, and this is definitely a very heartwarming story. It's kind of a sad story in some places, but it definitely shows the kind of writer that Kate is, I think. And she really gets you to care about the characters, especially Opal, and you care a lot about Winn-Dixie, and you care a bit about the preacher when you hear about him. But yeah, we're going to be reading like the first four chapters of Because of Winn-Dixie, and my voice started going out a little bit after chapter four. That's why I kind of stopped. But we're going to go ahead and keep on reading and recording more of it. But let's see here. I don't own the rights to this, and all of this is just going to be for entertainment purposes only, and only for fun here in the den. So let's go ahead, grab your favorite snacks, anything like that, your favorite beverage, and let's just snuggle up close and listen to Because of Winn-Dixie. Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate D. Camilla. For Terry and Beck, because they listened first. Let's see here. Let's go straight to chapter 1. Or wait, let's do the introduction by Anne Patchett. When Kate D. Camilla wrote Because of Winn-Dixie, she was working at a book warehouse picking books and filling orders. Because her shift started at 7 o'clock in the morning, she would set her alarm clock for 4:30 so she could have 2 hours to write. I had wanted to write for a long time, and in those early morning hours before I left for the warehouse, I finally settled into doing the work of writing. She told me. After trying short stories and picture books, she started a novel about a girl named Opal who rescues a scruffy dog who's afraid of thunderstorms. A dog who never wants to be left alone. Opal understands this, and she has had issues of being left herself. From the moment their eyes met across the crowded produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store, Opal knows that she and the dog are meant for each other. Opal calls him and he comes to her. I think it is the central fantasy of childhood, and maybe of life, that you alone can see the goodness and potential in someone whose goodness and potential is invisible to everyone else. Because Opal loves Winn-Dixie, and it's suddenly obvious that he's a remarkable dog, and because Winn-Dixie is devoted to Opal, people know that Opal must be an exceptional kid. This is the transforming magic of love. I knew I had done something big, Opal thinks when she rescues Winn-Dixie by telling the grocery store manager that he's her dog, and maybe something stupid, too. But I couldn't help it. What she didn't know was that Winn-Dixie would rescue her as well. He saves her from loneliness. He stands by her side as she learns to listen. And it's by listening that Opal finally makes friends in the new town where her and her father have moved. This book is about taking a chance on someone that winds up saving your life. And it's also a book about growth and change. That's one of the things that makes this anniversary edition so special. The story you are now holding has changed since its original publication. When the book was first written 20 years ago, Opal went to the library looking for something to read aloud to her friend Gloria Dump, and Miss Franny Block gave her a copy of Gone with the Wind. Years later, Kate DiCamillo started to think more critically about Gone with the Wind and its biases and prejudice, and she regretted that she had not given Opal and Gloria Dump a different book to share. She thought it's time for a few things to change. People kept growing up, no matter how old they are. Not only are we allowed to change, it's essential that we do. Winn-Dixie was a mangy mess of a dog who was no doubt on his way to the pound. And he changed because Opal loved him. Opal was a lonely girl with no one to talk to, and she had changed because of a dog loved her. Katie Camello got up in the dark and wrote before going to work in a warehouse, and she changed because she never gave up on her dream. Through love and chance and perseverance, Winn-Dixie and Opal and Kate all went to have better lives. And now, because of Winn-Dixie, has gone to be a better, more thoughtful book. Because of Winn-Dixie has been read by millions and millions of people. They've cried and laughed and felt understood because of it. Some of them even felt rescued, while others have been reminded to reach out a hand to someone who could use it. Because it's not just dogs and friends who need rescue. It's a book, and especially loved one. This one. Oh man, I got that wrong. Because it's not just dogs and friends who rescue us. It's books, especially this one. Okay. Oof. Because of Winn-Dixie. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let this dog in here?" he kept shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There was just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor. Tomatoes and onions and green peppers, and there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way that the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a really good time. His tail was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never in my life seen a dog smile, but that's just what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth, and he wagged his tail so hard they knocked some oranges off a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running right over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs, and you could tell all he really wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. but somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day, because lying there on the floor, right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, really concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I howled. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All of the Winn-Dixie employees turned and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big. And maybe stupid, too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to a pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears in the air and looked at me as if he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again, and then I figured that the dog, probably just like everybody else in the world, that he wanted to be called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." And that dog trotted over to me, just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said, "honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into the grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "But he got in by mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look real good. He was big, but skinny, and you could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled his teeth and showed all of them. He smiled so big it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "Yeah, I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy, because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach, and so in my mind I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because it was his mother's name, and he loved his mother a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher, and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers, and suffering people to go to the grocery store. "But you know what?" I told Winn-Dixie. "You're a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn-Dixie looked at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he'd have to behave right and be quiet, because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher, and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alford, called an exception. and I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats, or Mrs. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in a living room, working at a little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he was thinking hard. "Daddy?" I said. He said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" he said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminds me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. "Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while?" Finally, the preacher looked up at me. "Opal," he said, "what are you talking about?" "I found a dog," I told him, "and I want to keep him." "No dogs," said the preacher. "We talked about this before. You don't need a dog." "I know it," I said. "I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look," I said. I went to the trailer door and hollered, "Winn-Dixie!" Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air, and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs, his matted-up fur, and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn-Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I ever saw one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. "And the less fortunate, too. That's for sure." "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked with a real softly to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," said the preacher, "I guess you found one." Chapter 3. I started in on Winn-Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. First, I used the garden hose and had some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him real good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. "See," I said, "you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her. I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans." Winn-Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him. like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn-Dixie looked down at the ground, like he was trying hard to remember if he had. You know what? I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard. More than I ever did when we were in Watley. Winn-Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back, but he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad. Winn-Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn-Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn-Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur had all cleaned up nicely. It was all shiny and soft. You could see his ribs still, but I intended to feed him good and would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth, because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into a trailer and showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new Winn-Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn-Dixie. Well now, don't you look handsome? Winn-Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head into the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said really quick before I lost my nerve, I've been talking to Winn-Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said. He scratched Winn-Dixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things. That's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn-Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. 1 thing for each year I've been alive, I told him. Please? Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher and kinda gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn-Dixie, I should have guessed you were gonna be trouble. Then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said. Sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mama. Chapter 4 1, said the preacher. We were sitting on the couch, and Winn-Dixie was sitting between us. Winn-Dixie had already decided that he liked the couch a lot. 1, said the preacher again. Winn-Dixie looked at him kinda hard. Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh. 2, he said. She had red hair and freckles. Just like me, I said. Just like you, said the preacher, nodding. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and grow a car. Winn-Dixie started chewing on his paw. I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you could never let her get a head start, because she would beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Watley, I raced Liam Fullerton and beat him, And he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with. I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded. He was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, he said. She couldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She couldn't make heads nor tails of a piece of meat. 6. The preacher rubbed his nose and looked up at the ceiling. Winn-Dixie looked up too. Number 6 is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones and ones that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing with himself. What's number 7? I asked. Let's see, he said. She knew all of the constellations, every planet in the night sky, every last one of them. She could name them and point them out, and she never got tired of looking up at them. Number 8, said the preacher with his eyes closed, was that she hated being a preacher's wife. She said she couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge her for what she was wearing or what she was cooking or how she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. Winn-Dixie lay down on the couch. He put his nose on the preacher's lap and his tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. 9, said the preacher. She drank. She drank beer and whiskey and wine. Sometimes she couldn't stop drinking. That made me and your mama fight quite a bit. Number 10, he said with a long sigh. Number 10 is that your mama loved you. She loved you very much. But she left me. She left us, said the preacher softly. I could see him pulling his head back into his stupid turtle shell. She packed her bags and left us, and she didn't leave one thing behind. Okay, I said. I got up off the couch and Winn-Dixie hopped off too. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went back to my room and wrote down all 10 things that way the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he said them to me so that I wouldn't forget them, and then I read them aloud to Winn-Dixie until I had them memorized. I wanted to know those 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever came back, I could recognize her, and I would be able to grab and hold her on tight and never let her get away from me again. Okay. Well, we got through chapters 1 through 4, and then my voice started to kind of give out on me a bit, so I wasn't able to read any more of it just yet. And also with the dogs around, a lot of the times it is kind of hard to read or record anything, and sometimes with the wife around too, it is a bit hard to record. But that's okay, we can work around these things, and at some points in the future I will be getting the rest of the chapters read through this book, and we'll get them recorded and get them put together, and maybe try and do them in like 4-chapter chunks. That'll be kind of fun. So it'll be somewhere around half hour each episode or so. So let's hope that we can get through it. Oh, I love this book so much, and I hope you guys enjoy it too. I know my daughter loved it. I've loved it. It's just so much fun to read, and just, Winn-Dixie is such an amazing character. I hope you guys are enjoying it, and I hope you guys will continue to join me on the journey of reading through Because of Winn-Dixie. I love all you bipeds, quadrupeds, and even the occasional dinosaur so much. And remember, when you go out, if you want to help, remember to keep trying to mask up when you do go out. It'll help keep you and your family safe. If you haven't done it yet, go out and get your vaccinations and your booster shots. That will keep you, your family, and strangers safe. And also, let's try and distance ourselves a little bit from people out there. Oh man. Uh, Especially like in America, we have school starting again, and that means a lot of kids, a lot of germs, and a lot of sickness spreading around. So let's try and help keep ourselves a bit healthier by getting our vaccines and just trying to help our immune system just a little bit. And doing all of this, we do have a little one here in the den that we can hashtag protect the lioness. Okay, so we will get more of these chapters read whenever we can and try and get these put out as soon as we can. Oh, I hope you guys enjoy. I love you bipeds, quadrupeds, and even the occasional dinosaurs so much. So until next time, Wolf out.